Okay, so welcome to our program today. We're going to begin with a very short clip, about less than 7 minutes, from the documentary In Our Hands. This documentary was directed and produced by Robert Richter and Stan Warnow and documents June 12th, 1982.
Jeremiah said that the people took to the streets. I think that's what we need to do. If we're going to reach peace, we have to walk on the way of peace and walk together as one.
This is sort of the ultimate movement, isn't it? Because we don't stop this, there's nothing else to fight for.
You can't be alive and sane without being involved. I don't. So one way or another, you can choose to ignore the involvement, but I'm involved because I'm alive.
I had never done this before, and I wanted to be counted at some time during my life. This is very crucial. I think it's a world emergency.
I'm here with the other performing artists for nuclear disarmament. I'm marching with that group, which are all around me, and it's the whole theatrical community of New York, I think.
The way this situation was set up was the various groups were assigned streets where their people were to mass. They have done that, and you just see this crush of humanity poised and waiting to come out onto First Avenue to march past the speaker's platform here. We understand that there are possibly 5,000 people in each street. So if we assume that there are 6 streets, that would be about 30,000 people right here, but there's really no way of knowing exactly how many there are gathered to march right now. John Russell, 1010 wins outside the UN.
We are coming from Japan. Our country is the only country in the world that suffered the atomic bombing.
I was 27 when I was bombed in Hiroshima.
I never knew my husband's family because they all died from the atomic bomb. None of them survived. None of them. I had cancer operations when I was 23, and then 26, then 28. 2/3 of my stomach was removed. I came here to say that human beings have made a mistake in developing nuclear weapons. Our suffering should serve as a testament that the world should never again be devastated by the atomic bomb.
Okay, let's go! Okay, let's go!
Nuclear war, whether it's limited or not. It's nonsense to talk about limited nuclear war.
Keep them coming if you possibly can. Thanks a lot.
I came because to me this isn't a political issue, it's a survival issue. And I think that people who are for almost anything, if you really sit down and listen to the facts, really would be for this. Specifically, I came today because I thought the more people who showed up, the more the United Nations would know how the people of this country are feeling about this issue, and it seemed real important to me. Because I think everybody's come out today. I don't think it's just any particular group or any side. It's not right or left, it's everybody.
I want to live. I want to be somebody. I want to be able to live and learn something. I'm for anything that has the people united. The people united cannot be divided. That's what they were saying. That's all it's about. They said that black and Puerto Rican people aren't united. Look at them. Look at all of them.
Was it for you to get up here today? We started at 5 a.m. from Leesburg, Virginia, Loudoun County. We're Loudoun County Citizens for Nuclear Disarmament. We're supporting the freeze. Our county council passed a freeze resolution just 2 months ago, the day after we had our very first meeting. Now I've got to move on. My sign's going. Goodbye, friends.
The message that Reagan stopped the nuclear bomb soon, and he shouldn't change his mind, because our minds will not change unless he stops.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Anderson. I am the president of Peace Action New York State, and I want to invite you to what is a really historical moment in this hour. It is a connection of history. It is an opportunity to consider lessons learned, and even greater than I could express it, to hear it from someone who was key in the organizing. And before I introduce her, let me also say, in looking at that clip, of course, you know that was only several minutes of the clip. And it will be important for you to look at that film again, not just once, but over and over. You can easily see that it was an intersectional moment. And something you should note is that the participation that came from art, from age groups, from the diversity of race, certainly would make you think, if you didn't know this was 1982, you might think it was 2014 in the climate march. But it's not. It was one of the first marches to pull together so many people. People say 1 million, people say upwards of 1 million. By sight, you can see there was many, and they indeed came from the four corners of the world. And so we are here, and together we're going to learn some things and hear some things that we didn't know that we need to act upon. And so I thank you, I welcome you, and without further ado, let me introduce our interviewer or interviewee for this afternoon, Cora Weiss. And also at some point, she may ask some of her fellow compadres from the moment to say a word somewhere along the way, and she may not. But I already know some of them stand ready. And with that said, again, Cora, I want to welcome you. I want to go right at you with questions, and then I'll pop the question. You can just start right out as you want. I said, and as everybody sees, that was an intersectional moment. The first question is, how did you accomplish that organizing when we had no cell phones, no Twitter, no Facebook, the conveniences that we have today, and yet you pulled so many people from so many different issue areas? How did you do it? Or how did you and the others do it?
Thank you, Jim. And Bob Richter, that was so nostalgic to watch that footage. It's so beautiful. And so many people. We won't do it again, but we'll do something else as big. Thank you, Jim. How did we do June 12? Well, the organizers for it are watching here, I think. Leslie Kagan, David Courtwright, and people from the Freeze. We had fax machines. If I knew how to get my computer over to my fax machine, I would show it to you so people can know what a fax machine is. We had fax machines and we had word of mouth. And there's a woman here from the press. We had press. We had radio. Radio is a wonderful instrument. Some people should get to know it. And that's how it grew. And it grew because SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, was growing all over the country. The Freeze was launched in around 1980, I think, and was growing with voting for legislation. I think Dagmar Wilson, you saw, who talked about people there from Virginia. She was the founder of Women's Strike for Peace. And they passed legislation in their town to support the Freeze, to freeze nuclear weapons. When we got to June 12, of course, we were talking about abolishing nuclear weapons when Reverend William Sloane Coffin released the helium balloons into the sky and bellowed, "Goodbye, nuclear weapons." Well, that was 1982. And unfortunately, our job is not over.
That's right. Let me, again, looking at the crowd that had gathered, one of the things that I want to dig deeper into that is on these different issue areas. Here today, there is much talk about trying to get the various issue areas to connect with the understanding of the impact of foreign policy, the peace work, and yet, while it seems like we're trying to pull those together, at that event, they were there. Was the understanding in those groups more about understanding the damaging impact that it has on people and planet, nuclear weapons? Or was it the opportunity coming to link the messages together, understood in some way that the effort to continue this buildup of weapons and the money's spent on it is the money's needed to address the needs of the people? Was there seemed, I recall, to be understanding, but I wonder from your view, did you see it that way, or how did you see it?
I think it was understood, and David Courtwright is here, I think, and he can correct me. I think it was pretty well understood that while this was a disarmament and the nuclear weapons event, it was for peace and justice. It was for equality. It was for transferring military budget money to meet human needs. I think most of the speakers touched on those. You know, life is not made up of one issue. And I think that political movements have to stop using siloization and start linking, not merging, but linking the issues. We can't have a world that's suitable for our children and grandchildren and theirs unless we have peace with justice, a nuclear weapon-free world with gender and other equality, and the end to poverty and racism. The issues are huge, and they're all existential threats to our survival, and we have to make the world safe for everyone.
Indeed. You know, the additional thing that I want to say in this moment as we speak, because our presence here today is quite intergenerational in that for those who don't know, but we do know that we have a class of 8th graders from a school in Texas who are very much engaged in researching and looking at this issue, and who have also been noted in their own community for the work they've already done in the research around peace. And it speaks to the oncoming generation that everybody has their hope in. The oncoming generation, which is actually the front line of our future, is quite different from the young people in, say, in 1982. What would you say was because there wasn't a ton of young people at 1982, there were some, but what would you say was the kind of mindset of young people back in 1982 around this issue?
Well, I never wanted to correct a colleague, but two of the highlights of the event for me personally were just little stories. All of a sudden, somebody handed me a note standing on the stage, and it said, "Pass this to Cora." The note came from 2 students from the University of Wisconsin who hitchhiked from Madison to New York, and all it said was, "We made it." They were a mile away from me at the very end of the march in Central Park. And the other story is my daughter, Cora Weiss, was with me to help me on the stage, and she's now a film producer. But she brought a friend her age also. And the friend was working at the snack counter on the back of the stage, and she met a nice young man. They've been married ever since. So there were plenty of young people, thank you, and they were terrific. And there are always going to be young people. This news today about the students from Wyoming graduation who all booed the woman state senator who was the speaker because she made a slur about trans people, and the whole graduating class rose and got her off the stage. So there are terrific young people. It's so reassuring. There are younger people doing the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which is having a big meeting in Vienna soon. And have you been to Times Square if you live in New York? Anybody living in New York who's watching today or listening? There's a huge art and music and educational program. I think it's called Atomic Amnesia. Not sure about that. It is, thank you. And it's fantastic. It's on until Sunday, I'm told. So if you're in the city, check it out. It's an anti-nuclear demonstration that includes art and music and education.
Indeed,
Young
yeah.
people.
In fact, it's the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation that is playing a big part in that in Times Square. The moment too was quite different racially. What was your view in that moment compared to this moment?
Well, I was very happy when I saw that Bob Richter included some people of color in his movie, because it began to bother me that it was for whites only. But the times were different, and I think we probably weren't sensitive enough to make sure that we had total inclusion and total diversity. And we worked at it. There were people from everywhere and of all backgrounds and colors, but not enough.
Yeah,
but I think now we would be getting more equality. Don't you, Bob?
Absolutely, absolutely.
You know, Bob's film also reflects a great presence of art. And nowadays you see art being brought to the forefront in so many ways and so many styles, whether it's by articles, things that they make visually, or even spoken word, even music, even in the way the various dance interpretation, art is so involved. And Bob, in doing this, had you and Cora, had you and Bob talked about what, how to feature these things during that? Had there been any discussion, or and as well as the artists that showed up, significant artists that show up? What role how did y'all collaborate on that?
Well, the answer to that is we gathered footage from 43 independent camera teams. Guinness Book of Records worthy mention of that many volunteers for the biggest peace march in history in this country. And it was the footage that determined how we would shape the film, who we would include in the film, our effort to make it present as broad a sweep of the actual event that took place, as well as the entertainment and the speakers on stage in Sheep's Meadow. And as we whittled down the footage from the 43 camera crews, the shape of the film and the content of the film gradually emerged from the material. It wasn't planned ahead, except we knew about the activities, the schedule on stage. The rest of it was the camera teams designated to go to various parts of the city and film what was going on. And what was going on, we couldn't predict for sure. We hoped a lot of interesting stuff and sometimes humorous stuff was going on. And indeed it was. And we basically picked out what we thought was the best of the footage and strung it together. Stan was our senior editor. He had previously been one of the two major editors of a film called Woodstock, which probably many of you are familiar with or know about. And Stan had replaced Marty Scorsese as one of the two main editors of Woodstock. So he knew what he was doing. And we had a dozen or so volunteer editors, also sticking in their bits from a week to a few months, all volunteers. And
what you did, the film alone is so touching. And what I would ask Cora, I know for me that one of the big insights on this issue was listening to the voices of the Habakasha, who voices down the corridor of time, steady, consistent, warning us about the weapons to such a degree that now we're in a time where we have the TPNW, the treaty against that prohibits nuclear weapons. And I'm wondering at that time, when marching, could you see that? Could you? I'm almost about to answer what I'm going to ask you. Could you see the possibilities of it, or was it that hope that you have to have for better things? Was there any consideration of such a treaty at that time?
Our view was we would do the best film we could make that would inspire as broad a section of the public that we could get to see the film. And one little thing about the Hibakusha, the survivor, as we were putting the film together near the end of the editing process, we focused on one of the Hibakusha, a woman who described what she experienced and how she survived. And one of our camera team members was a friend of Meryl Streep, the famous actress. And this woman, Mary Salter, knew Meryl Streep and got Meryl to come and be the English language voice that you hear when you hear the Hibakusha story. And Meryl showed up very pregnant, very hoarse with a cold, and determined the show must go on, even though she wasn't that well physically, and she did a wonderful job.
Indeed. Let me, Bob, let me have Cora talk about, respond to that.
Well, I'd like to talk about it in terms of looking back and seeing the success and the successes that were spawned by the demonstration. First of all, the demonstration didn't come about by itself. I mean, it came about because we were having a lot of nuclear weapons being built and money going into nuclear weapons instead of into human needs. But SANE, SANE Committee for Nuclear Policy, the Freeze, Women's Strike for Peace, which had already accomplished the persuasion of John F. Kennedy to sign the treaty for the prohibition of atmospheric testing of nuclear, we called them atomic bombs at the time. So we stood on shoulders. We weren't coming to this green. You can't say that anymore, can you? It means some, sorry about that. We were green. But I think it was easy to see that all these people, sorry, were going to go back to their countries. We had people from all over the world, New Zealand, Germany, Sweden, Japan, lots of places. They were going to go home to their countries inspired to do something, to turn fear into action. And that happened, and it grew and grew. And the General Assembly voted to get the International Court of Justice to give an opinion, an advisory opinion on the illegality of nuclear weapons. That was terribly important in 1996. And if 1 million people in Central Park hadn't been strong in their statement, I don't think it would have given confidence or encouragement to the rest of us to keep doing what we were doing, to create the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. That stands on shoulders. And to get this incredibly important decision from the International Court of Justice. Actually, some of the lawyers who were among the legal team for that event are on this program today. Welcome. Yeah. So one thing leads to another, and everything good has a legacy. And I think we can be proud of the history and remind people, as we're doing today with June 12, that it's possible. It was the police who told us how many people were there and how many more were coming, because they were getting reports from all over the United States. People are amassing to travel by bus or by hitchhike to New York. And the New York cops knew that, and they were supporting us. They were fantastic. They were very helpful. I hope it wasn't the last time.
Mm. There's a beautiful picture that captures you and the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Coretta Scott King, in an embrace. Can you share a little bit about your relationship?
Coretta and I were very good friends. And we used to call each other on the telephone when we were doing homework with our children. I think we both had 3 children, or did she have 4? I can't remember. 3 probably. And they're sort of the same ages. So we had that in common. And I was the secretary treasurer of the Gandhi Society for Human Rights, which was Dr. King's fundraising arm. for his work. So we were a team, and she was so reliable and so terrific. And she went to Geneva to the disarmament meetings with Women Strike for Peace. She was just wonderful, and we miss her a lot. She co-chaired a demonstration against the Vietnam War on November 15, 1969 in Washington with Reverend Coffin. You could call her up and say, what are you doing? And will you do this? And she never said no.
Wow.
Good woman.
In fact, I something too that I know, and I embrace what you just said, and I will add to it. There were a lot of good women, including yourself in this whole 1982 event. In fact, there were plenty women on leadership roles in pulling together in ways that it's just inspiring.
Jim, I'd like to, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I want to comment that Bill Hartung, who is a terrific researcher and activist in this field, commented to me and reminded me about the leadership role of women. And I started writing a list. It's incredibly impressive. Some of them are here. Dagmar Wilson, Leslie Kagan. I mean, I don't want to name drop and forget important people who are here. But it's not only 1982 that had women in leadership, it's today as well. Yeah. Beatrice Finn is the head of ICANN that just got the Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years ago. So that's a nice note to remind people about. Thank you for bringing it up.
Well, I have my heart is swollen with deep love for the uniqueness that you bring as a woman. I had the opportunity to in the pouring rain to lead the chant during the Women's March to ban the bomb, and when we marched to the UN in all that heavy rain. And so it's a pleasure to walk side by side on these issues that affect us all. And speaking of issues that affect us all, you know, here, I should say to you, I'm calling you from the city of Buffalo, which is my home, which, you know, we are going through a very deep grieving moment for some. But even I'm reminded in this moment as I reflect upon the Habakasha and what they experienced in the deep grief, and yet in the midst of the grief, able to keep the vision and the hope and the work going towards those things that need to be accomplished. And I think 1982, considering the political things that were going on, wasn't always in favor of the people. It was always what the young poet said during the inauguration, the hill we climb. It's been a hill that we've been climbing to get to that mountaintop that Dr. King could see the beauty from, but to make it a real reality, it's been that. And so the history around 1982 brings all of that. It was a grieving moment, money-wise for the nation. It was a grieving moment who expected the electeds to really operate with a real spirit of democracy and inclusion. But it was one that didn't get all those things met. And even today, we look at a military budget that is out, just grown off the chart. As it relates to the military budget back then, can you talk about, is there any reflection you can share in things that you pointed out? We know weapons we need to do away with nuclear arms, but the kinds of understanding that people had about the cost, money-wise, of these weapons.
it's always been not just too much, but why do you have such a budget for military if you're not going to use them? So they're dangerous, but they're dangerous before they're used because they suck money out of budgets for baby formula, among other things, and for everything we need, education, healthcare. I mean, you know the list, it's human needs. So I'm very angry about the meeting this morning, for example, of the two, unfortunately, they are women, prime ministers of Finland and Sweden, meeting in the White House, which supports money for nuclear weapons, and joining NATO, which is based on a commitment to nuclear weapons, even if it's only a last thought. It shouldn't be in there at all. And these are two countries that, well, everybody knows what these two countries are. But Olof Palme must be screaming, crying in his grave. You know, the Social Democrats have been the majority party until now in Sweden for many years. And Maj-Britt Turin, who spoke on June 12, 1982 at the rally, was a minister for disarmament in Sweden's cabinet. She would go out of her mind today if she were still with us about the amount of money that's being wasted, and it's sitting there is being used to take money away from other things that we really need to survive. So I think we have to think about lots of issues when we talk about nuclear weapons and money.
Indeed. You know, we reflected that earlier, it was such an intersectional gathering. And yet today, truthfully, we find parts of our community not well understanding about this issue. Many organizations, peace and social justice groups are talking about needing more young people and more people of color. And so the question I would ask, they were there then. What, if you have any thought about it, is the reason why we didn't bring them along with us from there? What happened?
You know, you wake up in the morning and wonder what today's crisis is. And people wake up in the morning sometimes hungry. So there are many issues, and who knows how many we brought along. Look, what does bringing along mean? How do you count the ways? There are lots and lots of issues that have to be dealt with. We need to fix this country and the world to live in it. And that means worrying about the climate, and we have to worry about nuclear weapons and climate change as the apocalyptic twins. We should not merge our organizations, but we should join our issues so that people understand that both climate and nukes are deadly for the world, for the planet and the people. There are the issues of poverty, of racism, of food insecurity. My God, you can talk all day about the issues. And people go towards the issues that they feel that they care about most. But look, there wouldn't be a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons if there weren't a massive base of civil society. Nothing changes without civil society pressure. Organized civil society and social movements are the biggest doers for social change. And so there must be people out there. We just have to change their fear into action. Sorry about the telephone. I thought I turned it off.
That's okay. You're absolutely right about helping our nation move, our people move beyond this fear. One of the things our political structure has been well at is kind of helping to get people in a state of paralysis by making them afraid that the rest of the world is coming at us. Thus, we in the political structure need to put more money into these big greedy weapons manufacturers to build more weapons to create more war. And they get away with it because of the underdevelopment and the kind of Pied Pipered into complacency of the people. We have a challenge as the workers and organizers on this issue to up our game. One of the challenges we have is some of the ways in which organizing was done has not moved the needle as effectively as we want. And the oncoming wave of the young people are coming with methodologies that are somewhat radical to some people and make some people hesitant to think that it has any value. But it has value, because I think our generation sometimes forgets that this oncoming generation is the bearers of the new knowledge and the new skills. And they know something. We just need to make room at the table for them. How are we doing on that in making room at the table for young people, for real participation and bringing in their ideas in leadership?
Well, I'll remind you about your own organization, Peace Action of New York State, that has organized chapters in every single college in this state. I think it's 20 or 27 schools. That is the most reassuring, wonderful news you can have today. They're doing the right thing at the right time with the right people. But it's not just young people. It's all people.
It's all people.
And women in 2000 had an idea that was born in the Hague Appeal for Peace Conference in 1999 in The Hague. And that is a Women, Peace and Security resolution that was unanimously adopted by the UN Security Council. And it says that women should be at all tables of decision making, at all levels of governance, and to help to prevent violent conflict, among other things. But participation is key, and prevention of violence is key, and it's law, it's international law. And if you don't have participation of women and other living things at the table, I say, go to court. They're breaking the international law. So we need everybody. Everybody has to talk, speak up, and act.
I want to push that comment a little further. I want to kind of let you rant on a little more about what would you say to all of us listening, young and old, in this moment are some of the things on your list that you would urge us to really get up and get on to it?
I think this thing that happened at Wyoming this morning or yesterday, where the graduates got rid of the woman who spoke because of her attack on trans people and on LGBTQ. It raises the question in this country, how many people aged 18 are registered to vote? And it's interesting that the students at Wyoming are basically 18 to 21, basically, for their graduation. And if they were taking that position, that action, it maybe says something about college graduations in the rest of the country. So I think campaigns to get young people to register to vote, whatever their color or their race or their religion or their anything, is an important move, because we see the percentages of 18-year-olds who are registered. None of them is over 50%, and they're mostly quite low. So that's a huge job if anybody wants a big job. Or you can just make it a regular job locally and check it out in your own communities, your own states. Bob Richter, I can't bear the fact that you're sitting there with so much knowledge. Say something.
Well, I've been fascinated listening to what you've been saying and taking it all in, soaking it all up. And I only feel that what happened June 12, 1982 is an inspiration for everybody. And we're inspired by the events of that day. And as you say, we have to organize for the future, and you can't get a good future unless you get people to vote and turn out on election day to vote the right way. So carry on.
You both, there's a somewhat of a question here, what I'm about to say, because it reminds me of a moment. It was in the early, it was probably just after 82. I, along with Reverend Herbert Daughtry, had occupied Sydenham Hospital up in Harlem. And one of the things inside, along with Reverend Timothy Mitchell from Breadbasket and Sini Williams, the Black social workers of New York State, and a few other folks, I think Diane Lacey, who was a local talk radio show host. But in it was the dynamics of watching these leaders that were coming, who represent different organizations and had, you know, similar thoughts and maybe different ways on how to accomplish what we're about, which gave you a moment to see the challenges at the table for leaders when they're trying to craft the way forward. When I think back in 1982, do you have any reflections or thought about the challenges that come no matter what when you have diverse leaders organizing together for one purpose? Can you share some insight about that or thoughts, or we can skip it?
Well, first, I haven't heard the name Sydenham Hospital for a long time, but my mother picked Sydenham Hospital to deliver my brother and myself, me, because it had the lowest infant mortality rate in the city, the best score for living babies. And on 126th Street or 5th Street, 26, I think. Anyway, that's where we were born. So thank you for bringing that up. I think probably every speaker, and I haven't heard their speeches for quite a while, but Bob Richter's film has them all. He also has film from the Hague Appeal for Peace. Every social movement, Richter has shot footage. He's the real historian in the group. But I think almost to a person, every speaker talked about money for food, not for weapons. They spoke about the end of, they talked about other issues, crises. This was before climate change was popular. And people understood the need to combine peace with justice. And I always add equality. Equality means racial, it means gender, it means all kinds of equality. And that's what life is. Life is multiple issues that have to all be dealt with. And we can't live in silos anymore. Single issue organizations, I think, are going to be having a harder time as more people recognize the need to join issues. But I've said that already today, I think.
But that's it.
Repetition is the best form of advertising, I'm told.
Jim, we have a couple of questions in the chat, and one was about, I'm just going to pull up my notes here that I pulled. One was about the opening of the UN's second special on disarmament, which took place at the same time. We haven't mentioned that. And
that was very important. And it was one of the reasons that we had a reverse the arms race program at the Riverside Church, the only church in the country with a disarmament office. That was started by Bill Coffin. I ran that for 10 years. And it was part of the reason for having the June 12th event. The second special session on disarmament at the UN was also about nuclear disarmament. And it was critically important. All the member states participate and talk about disarmament. And it was the second time they'd done it. Go ahead, Sally, sorry.
Yeah, I know Betty Reardon brought that up, and Joanne Dufour said that she wanted to mention Reverend Homer Jack of the Unitarian Universalist Church UN office for his work on that second special session, organizing it.
Okay, you've mentioned it.
And Roger Smith wanted us to comment on the role of Randy Forsberg in the campaign, the nuclear freeze campaign.
Well, somebody else in the audience might want to speak about Randy. Randy was the founder and the inspiration and the authority behind the freeze campaign, which chose to freeze nuclear weapons.
If somebody wants to speak specifically about Randy, they could raise their hand and we could see them. You raise your hand by going into reactions and then clicking on the raise hand feature at the bottom.
Wow.
Oh, I see Claire. Claire, do you want to unmute and we can bring you on to talk about Randy?
Claire, my goodness.
Hey there, Cora.
Well,
this will be brief, but just to say first, this is every June 12th, I come back to the memories of that day at both our march in San Francisco that had 50,000, but yours in New York with 1 million. Randy Forsberg, together with Randy Keeler, the two Randys, as we called them at the time, basically took the nuclear weapons freeze campaign national that year. It had begun as an initiative that they dreamed up out of faith-based organizations that began, I believe, first with a Massachusetts county vote. I don't know if I have that right. And then all the town halls in Vermont. And then it had such traction as a simple idea to call for a halt to testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons. But Randy Forsberg was really a visionary behind this, together with Pam Solo and Mike Jędrzejczyk and others. And the timing of the UN special session on disarmament and the march was the same year that we brought it to, I forget how many states voted, but it was 65% of the national population was voting that year. And we had a tremendous result where in every state but Arizona, I think we won. And Randy was just brilliant. She was the drafter, together with others, of the call to halt the nuclear arms race, which was our organizing tool. And just the other thing to say about that at the time was that it was such an incredible way to bring people on. And the fact that the march and the campaigns dovetailed with each other that year from an organizing perspective was huge. And I think the tremendous awareness and the threats from Reagan and others really brought it more to the fore. But Randy we lost her to cancer a number of years back. Randy Keeler is still out there and has been featured in films like the film about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, talking about his background. But really, the other memory that comes up is one of the first national gatherings of the nuclear weapons freeze campaign was in Boulder, Colorado, early in 1982, or perhaps the fall of 81. And that's what I remember, Cora. You talked about radio, you talked about newspaper, you talked about faxes, but I also remember that you personally barnstormed the entire country. You were at that meeting in Boulder, maybe a year ahead of time, calling for people to prepare to come to New York on June 12th. And that was the first time I met you. And I know that you went all over the country, as did others, but especially you did, to bring our attention that we should all be ready and prepared to pay attention to the special session on disarmament. So
Nice to see you again, Claire.
good to see you, Cora.
Wow. Speaking of that, radio, let's go back there because you mentioned radio earlier. And, you know, being a radio host myself here in Buffalo, I'm wondering, would you say a bit more about the use of media? You know, because a lot of people say we don't have the big commercial access to media, but I'd like to hear more from you about utilizing radio and other media forms that you might recommend to us.
Could I do the heretical and interrupt my hero, Cora Weiss?
Katrina will find you and bring you on. Just 1 second. Do you
No,
have
let
your
her
camera
talk,
on?
let her talk, let her talk.
Oh,
Yeah.
I have my camera on. I just wanted,
Okay. All right. Okay.
first of
I
all,
just need to
Cora Weiss,
find her.
my hero. She has lived in the spirit of we don't attempt what seems unimaginable, we will risk the unthinkable. And I wanted to say, just in terms of the media, and Cora always inspires the best of what I think of at The Nation, but in December 1980, we published a small editorial quoting Randy Keeler about the freeze. December 1980, it was out of Northampton and Deerfield, and it just quoted the provisions of the first referendum, and it went on, I think, to build around the country. But I wanted to say there's radio and there's faxes and there's telegraph and Twitter. There's also there are magazines which now exist often in the internet, but that played a role, I hope. And I always respect Cora's view of not siloing, and she has been a prophet, unarmed and peaceful, for the idea that the two existential crises of our time, the climate crisis, emergency, and the nuclear peril, should find ways to work more closely together. And if not now, when is a more important time? So it's an honor to be here with all of you. And we're trying to mark June 12th, 2022, the 40th anniversary, at a moment when I think more Americans, for better or worse, are aware of the nuclear peril.
Wow. Well, we have here, Katrina. Would you like to ask some additional questions to our guest?
No, I just I think that Cora's right about the younger generation. There's a boldness and a fearlessness, but there's also, you know, it's so tragic. It's that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a sense of a new world that was possible, and the demilitarizing, carrying across generations, and a kind of care, a mutual security, common security. I think of Cora as well. History is so important and done in a way that's not spinach, but you know, Sweden has joined NATO or is going to, but Olof Palme, it's the 40th anniversary, I think, Cora, right, of the Common Security Report, the Prime Minister, the leader of Sweden. And you go back to that, and it is so contemporary and so important. And I feared that we can't give up, but there is a regression. There's a sense of kind of rollback on so many fronts: voting rights, women's rights, people's rights, and on the militarization. But I think there's a common sense, I believe, in people. I think blaming the people is dead on arrival. And I think there will be, with movements and with people speaking to where people are, there will be a change. And change, as people on this call know better than I do, comes quickly. It doesn't come for a while, and then when it comes, it comes.
I'd like to
go ahead, Rob.
And Michael, Claire, Mike.
I'd like to say one brief thing. If you want to see all of In Our Hands, the film clip that briefly started this hour, go to June12thlegacy.com, and you will see a way to link to a Vimeo free presentation of the entire film, In Our Hands.
How many hours?
Excuse me?
How long is it?
It's 90-minute long feature film.
Good. Great.
We got another question.
Bring it.
Okay, it's from our friend in the International Peace Bureau, Ingeborg Breines. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Ingeborg, but it is, how do we get the American weapons out of Europe?
Michael, Claire, are you there? You are there, Michael. Come on, open. Can he get his mic opened?
It's open.
What's the answer to that question? How do we get nukes out of Europe?
So I was thinking about this earlier, Cora, when you're talking about the backdrop to 1982. And the backdrop to 1982 was that both the US and the Soviet Union were planning or had begun to deploy intermediate range and medium range nuclear weapons in Europe. And that stirred up so much trouble and dissent and protest, because that would have made a bridge between conventional war and all-out nuclear war. Right. And those were banned in 1987 with the INF Treaty. Now, the Trump administration abandoned the US participation in the INF Treaty, and the US is now building exactly the kind of weapons that were banned by that treaty. So one thing that we could do now, and this makes a direct connection with 1982, is to call for the ban of INF prohibited treaties in Europe, because they haven't been deployed yet, and many Europeans are likely to oppose this. So we can make a link between now and then and ban INF prohibited weapons. These are hypersonic weapons that the Army wants to deploy in the near future, and others like it that would be identical to the ones that were banned as a result of the 1982 protests.
I'm so glad you said all that. It was very smart, very, very smart. It brings me back to cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe, in Germany, and Petra Kelly. And Petra and I, we just did a documentary film shooting about her. Petra and I worked a lot together on the Pershing and nuclear and cruise missile campaign to get rid of them in Germany. And where do you start?
We have another question too for you. Should I give it? Okay. So this is from Alan Ware. This is a question for Cora. You were also instrumental in building bridges between USA and the USSR during the Cold War. How can bridges be built today with Russia without minimizing their illegal aggression and war crimes in the Ukraine?
You build bridges with the dissidents. I don't know if I ever thought I would say that, but Katrina, isn't that a good idea?
I think it's a very good idea, but you build with those who inside Russia have been part of an opposition, which has been suppressed and repressed, and you build. They're also mothers, Cora, like mothers who are not outright dissidents, but who have seen the body bags come back and the fresh graves. I mean, you build.
That's what happened with Afghanistan.
I know,
when the mothers stood there watching the body bags come back. And then they became an organization of mothers against the Afghan war.
I mean, it's very difficult at this point, but the danger that it's become a proxy war between the United States, NATO, and Russia, however criminal and illegal Russia's invasion, I think we need to escalate a push for ceasefire and negotiations and not a push for more weapons to begin with, because I know that's hard to say because it's so brutal and barbaric, but the longer this war goes on, the more people will suffer, the more damage, the more reconstruction. And Michael and I have talked a lot. This is very much the Atlantic European framework. In the global South and in Central Latin America, people are being hurt by food prices, by medical shortages, as we are in this country. So that is also an impact of the war. But I do think the danger of demonizing Russia is something we should avoid, because they're good people inside Russia. The elite, the government, the war party, yes, but those who are trying to, many have left to Yerevan or Tbilisi, Georgia. Many are coming to other parts, but they're people who want a different future for their country. And I think the longer it's Russia, Russia, Russia equal Putin, Putin. I mean, it's very tough. And I think exchanges, which you've been part of, Cora, are important. Those go on, people exchanges. And
it never hurts.
But I will say, in terms of what Michael said, I heard the other day from someone who'd gone to a conference at Stanford with Bill Perry, former defense secretary, said that at the moment there are no even low-level working groups discussing nuclear issues. And I think that's not even heard of at the height of another Cold War. And I think that's very dangerous. That as Michael knows, we've talked a lot, it's about miscalculation, misunderstanding, in addition to just outright use. But when there are no discussions.
Low level in the governments or in
the United States and Russia.
Uh-huh.
Which have existed at the worst times in the Cold War, but there are no contacts. They've been cut off.
Right.
So.
Jim, there's other comments from Ann Wright that I think maybe Cora wants to comment on. Cora was helpful to the Women Cross DMZ in planning their trip to North Korea and crossing the DMZ, and also with Bridges with North Vietnam to deliver packages and mail to POWs. I think that you might want to comment on that, Cora.
Well, you're right. And you've got a good memory for the past.
That was from Ann Wright, who
I know Ann Wright. Yeah, that was nice of you to remember. It takes civil society to think of doing things that governments don't dare to do or are not smart enough to do. So Reagan was it Reagan? Who was the president? Reagan was saying that we were going to continue bombing North Vietnam until they stopped, quote, torturing our prisoners of war, unquote. And we decided to take that pretext for continuing the bombing away by trying to get a list of names of who was in fact a prisoner of war, trying to improve the quality of their boxes of gifts 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, and do that by establishing a letter a month. One letter from the family to the prisoner or to the alleged prisoner, because we would get back mail from the prisoners of war and determine who in fact was alive in a prisoner of war camp. And it closed down. I mean, if we continued the bombing, they would continue to shoot down the planes and make more pilots prisoners of war. So it was a dumb idea to continue the bombing campaign. Anyway, it was a very unique adventure that we had for 3 years. I think it's the first time it ever happened in wartime, in any war. And it seems to have made a bit of a difference. With the North Koreans, it's very important to try to create a peace zone out of the DMZ, which is about what, 20 or 30 miles long and a few miles wide. And I can see it as a place for peace education and meetings, reunification meetings between family members in the South and in the North. And I've wanted to see that happen. Maybe one day it will. But we've got to unify Koreas, and we've got to stop the antagonism and the warmongering. And then maybe they'll stop making missiles and testing them, which only pollutes the water and threatens.
And the planet.
Right. I forget the planet sometimes.
The question came up Well, not a question. It called for us, yes, avoid demonizing the Russian, but in it, it also says we should have a major push for diplomacy and negotiation. What would that look like in your view?
Me or Katrina? She's the Russia expert.
Michael.
I'm kind of taking you in a cluster. I'm taking it Cora and T.
Look,
yes.
During the height of the Cold War, Gorbachev and Reagan met, right? They had a summit in Reykjavik, and I went to the one in Geneva. And women created an organization called Women for a Meaningful Summit, which was meant to keep the doors open between the two countries. It was really an interesting time. And I don't know, we could play with that idea and develop it and propose it to the Bidens of this world and the Putins of this world. But Putin is not an easy person to A, persuade, and B, reach even, and trust. I mean, they don't abide by their decisions.
Katrina?
You know, I was on a very good call this morning, the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord. It's usrussiaaccord.org. And it was a talk about where does Russia head, even with this, criminal war with us. But what's clear is that the party of war inside Russia has emerged as the strong force. These are people who've studied Russia and the right wing and illiberalism in Russia, and not to be alarmist, but it could be worse post-Putin. But many things you can't do anything with Putin there. But it's not just Putin. There is a class around him. That Michael knows this better than there was something called the Minsk Accord, which in 2014, 2015, until about 2 years ago, was viable a year ago. And it was about autonomy and freedom and sovereignty for Ukraine and federalization for the Donbass area, language rights, security guarantees for Ukraine. That is hard now to return to. The question is what we'll return to. It could be a protracted war, a guerrilla war akin to Afghanistan, with weapons pouring in, primarily from NATO and US. It could be a negotiated resolution, and it could get, those are really the two. Protracted looks more and more likely. I think Michael should say something, but the weapons pouring in, and by the way, the change of strategy in the last few weeks, that it's now about weakening Russia, not working for Ukraine's freedom and sovereignty as the sole, but weakening.
Didn't that idea come from Austin?
When it comes from a defense secretary, there's often even higher. Right. But there are statements made that have to be dialed back. But you know what they say about gaffes, right? Gaffes are often the truth that get revealed in a way that's not helpful, but it is not helpful for diplomacy. And finally, the narrative of, Putin is a very hard, brutal figure. You just look at Chechnya. The playbook was played out on a smaller scale. He wasn't what he was today when he came to power, and his first act was to give Yeltsin and his family immunity, or the first country to call Bush W after 9/11. But, he's the narrative that he's Hitler isn't conducive to negotiation. And I think, I'll say finally, I think overall there's been a problem in our country where diplomacy and compromise is too often viewed as appeasement or capitulation. And there's been a degrading of that thinking because of the hyper militarization. But Michael's thought a lot about, where we are.
Yeah. So Jim, we should probably wind up soon. Thank you.
I did want to add a little tag on to that last question and focus on Russia, but also evolving is the verbiage that comes up about China and North Korea. So do you see the approach somewhat cookie cutter for all or uniquely different for each one of them?
Are you addressing Michael or?
Along with the question, I think Michael's getting ready to speak, and I would welcome Michael to speak to that too.
Well, thank you. I really want to defer to Cora and Katrina and the other women who we're honoring on this occasion. So
Great.
I don't want to take up a lot of space.
Great.
It's okay.
I do worry that this crowd in Washington, the war camp in Washington, views Russia as just part of the campaign they're engaged in. Their real target is China. So
Yeah.
I'm very glad, Jim, that you raised that, because they see that containing China is their number one priority. Russia they thought of as a secondary threat that can be dealt with, and they think they're dealing with Russia, but the greater threat is China in their view. And once Russia is dealt with, they're going to go after China with a vengeance. So we should really be prepared to contest the demonization of China as much as that of Russia. And I'll put in the chat a place you could go that addresses that.
Oh, good.
Thank you. Cora?
Well, in 2020, which I think is the last time I went to the UN, we had a conference called War No More, and 700 plus students and teachers came. It was the last public event, I think, before the lockdown for COVID. And Michael was a speaker about speaking of hypersonic weapons. But War No More is an important idea to begin getting into people's heads. You know, wars have laws that guide them, what's legal, what's not legal, what you can do and what you can't do. I think the time for war to go has come in a very serious way. And if you have a congressman or a senator who wants to vote more money for more weapons, and weapons are used to make wars, we have to vet them and we have to get rid of them, or tell them to get them to change their minds. But the whole institution of war is an institution that has got to go. The way colonialism basically went, slavery basically went. I mean, we've abolished other major terrible institutions. So I think we can try to abolish war.
Well, there's probably a lot more we could say and pull at you and from all of you. But Cora, this has been a special moment beyond an hour, enriched by those who have participated with you, who know you well, enriched by those who are all in attendance, and done in a unique way. It wasn't a webinar potentially to do this. It was to kind of have this kind of conversation. I'm glad I wasn't left alone to talk to you, because I do think we do better together, and because we do. And the final words I want to give to you, and as we do, I'm sure when I thank the staff of Peace Action and the work of the just monumental Sally Jones in this whole putting this together, and I'm like you. And so I'll give the floor to you, Cora, and Cora will be the last word, and you will receive copies on the video from this. And just thank you all for making this afternoon quite special and unique. And it's only the beginning of our venturing in to the legacy of June 12th and the many lessons we need to learn. Cora, the floor is yours.
Well, I never expected this, but I started by saying hello to my friends and to my new friends. And so now I want to say hello to all my friends who I think who have gathered here today. And I'm sure that we all have a lot to think about. And I think perhaps one of the lessons learned is we do have to turn fear into action, and we have to find out where to do the actions and what the action should be. But we should not tolerate aggression and hatred and inequality and racism at all. And we shouldn't tolerate war. And that means we shouldn't make heroes out of war planners. We don't want women at the war table. We want nobody at the war table.
Amen.
So you got your work, folks. Let's go out and do it. And thank you, Richard,
Thank you.
Robert, Bob, Richter. You're not what's wrong with the world. You're a terrific filmmaker and historian of important peace events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon all. Keep the faith and press on.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jim, Cora, Bob.
Thank you, Cora.
Trina.
Thank you, Cora.